My name is Deanna Carr, and this is my digital connection project on the disenfranchisement of Black Americans throughout United States history. During the Reconstruction era, Congress ratified the 14th Amendment to protect the right to vote for all American citizens, regardless of gender, class, or race. The 14th Amendment also protected equal protection under the law and secured due process for all people. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment were ratified shortly after the Civil War as measures to help repair the status of Black Americans in the United States, whom at the time were majority slaves that were not granted rights or protections under the law. During the 1870s to an early 1900s, however, Southern lawmakers set their priority to ensure Black Americans were unable to vote in elections by enforcing what was known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, which also segregated Black Americans from white Americans, disenfranchised Black Americans by setting up unjust goalposts in order to participate in elections. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause were a few methods used to prevent Black Americans from voting. Literacy tests were advanced written exams that were administered prior to voting to ensure voters were competent enough to participate. However, most Black Americans were not given sufficient education during their servitude, so they could not read or write, therefore not able to pass any literacy test. Poll taxes were hefty fees placed at the front doors of polling locations, and since many Black Americans did not have well-paying jobs, if any job, they could not afford the tax and were unable to vote. Most constraining, though, was the grandfather clause, which stated a person could only vote if their ancestor was able to vote before the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1867. This prevented a majority of Black Americans from voting even into the 1900s because most Black Americans' ancestors were subjected to slavery and ineligible to vote. Many Americans today believe the United States has since made heavy strides to correct the systematic racism of the past, but Black voter disenfranchisement is still alive today in the form of the new Jim Crow, the American prison industrial complex. If an American citizen is convicted of a felony, in most cases they lose their right to vote completely, and unsurprisingly, Black men make up a disproportionate amount of felony convictions in prison. The American criminal justice system unjustly targets Black men with felony convictions to further disenfranchise Black voters. Mass incarceration is a form of systematic racism that many scholars today refer to as the new Jim Crow. The war on drugs and stop and frisk laws were policies that targeted young Black men, and during the 1980s to early 2000s, the American prison industrial complex saw a spike in incarceration rates. During the war on drugs, President Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan declared there was an epidemic of crack cocaine use and created a tough-on-crime era for recreational drug use. Black Americans were stereotyped as crack cocaine users, while white people preferred powder cocaine. So naturally, Black Americans were punished 10 times more for crack use compared to powder cocaine use. The 100-to-1 crack versus powder cocaine sentencing states that for every 100 grams of powder cocaine is equal to 1 year sentence of jail time or prison time, versus every 1 gram of crack cocaine is considered a 1 year prison sentence. So, for example, if someone is in possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine, they will only serve a maximum of 5 years in prison, versus if someone had 5 grams of crack cocaine, they are subjected to the same 5-year sentence. You cannot vote if you are incarcerated, but even when inmates are released, they face more obstacles for the right to vote. Many collateral consequences follow a felony conviction in the criminal justice system, such as a loss of housing, unemployment, and a loss to access of higher education. Many of these consequences also factor into the right to vote. To register to vote, you need a permanent address, but this is not possible if you have a felony conviction and cannot secure public housing, or if you're unemployed, which many employers bar felons from job searches, so you can't afford private housing either. Many states require government identification to vote, but government IDs need a permanent address and a payment of $25, which for the reasons I stated earlier is not possible for previously convicted felons. These are all forms of Black disenfranchisement in America and the perpetuation of Jim Crow laws from the 1800s. So these are all different measures that white supremacist policies put in place to ensure that Black Americans cannot vote, such as the Jim Crow laws in the late 1800s or early 1900s and the current collateral consequences of a felony conviction in the United States prison system.